What if I told you that law, at its very core, isn't really about justice or morality at all? What if it's actually more like a technical protocol, like the code that runs a machine? Today, we're going to strip law down to its most basic structural components to ask a really fundamental question. Does it even work?
When we think about law, our minds naturally go to these big, heavy concepts, right? We think about justice, human rights, the balance of power. That's the stuff of courtroom dramas and big political debates.
But what if, to really get what makes law possible, we have to look at it from a completely different angle? What if we saw it as a kind of technical specification, a machine designed for one thing, making decisions? And that machine either functions correctly or it breaks down completely based on a really strict set of internal rules.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, here's the path we're going to take. First, we'll look at the radical method this kind of analysis demands. Then, we'll check out the simple binary verdict it gives. We'll cover the basic rules for what even makes law meaningful. Then, we're going to put the system through 5 critical stress tests. And finally, we'll see why looking at law through this new lens is, well, so powerful.
So first things first, let's talk about the method. To really dig into law's deep structure, we have to do something called a methodological suspension. And yeah, it sounds complicated, but all it really means is we have to temporarily set aside everything we think we know about the purpose or the goal of law. And that means we have to put some huge, and I mean huge concepts on the shelf for a minute. Power, rights, justice, even things like democracy. Now you might be asking, why on earth would we do that? Well, it's because every single one of these ideas already assumes that a working legal system exists. You can't use them to explain the very foundation they're built on.
And that leads to this core principle, which is just brilliant in its simplicity. It's a profound but really simple rule. If you want to understand what makes law possible in the first place, you can't use terms that only get their meaning after law is already up and running. That's just circular logic.
Okay, so if we're not allowed to judge a legal system as just or unjust, then how in the world do we evaluate it? Well, this framework gives us a super, stark, binary choice. There's absolutely no middle ground here.
On the one hand, a description of a legal system is admissible. That just means it works. It functions as a clear, decisive protocol for making decisions. Or it's indeterminate. And that's where the whole thing just structurally collapses. It doesn't become bad law. It stops being a description of law altogether. It just descends into total meaninglessness.
But hold on. Before we can even start testing a system to see if it's admissible, it has to pass a more basic test first. It has to be meaningful. It has to be coherent enough for us to even analyze it. So let's look at the 3 foundational conditions a legal description has to meet to even be in the game.
First is distinctiveness. Can the system tell the difference between a rule and the act of actually applying that rule? Second, comparability. Does it connect its decisions, treating similar cases in similar ways, or is every single decision just a random one-off event? And third, bounded discretion. Does it carve out a space for human judgment that's somewhere between a mindless computer algorithm on one side and pure arbitrary whim on the other? If a system fails even one of these, it's out. It's not even describing law.
Okay, so let's say a system passes those first 3 hurdles. It's meaningful. Now we get to the core of the analysis. We run it through 5 critical stress tests. This is where we find out if the protocol is actually structurally sound, if it's truly admissible.
The first test, and it's maybe the most basic one, is determinacy. And the question is simple: does the process of legal reasoning ever actually end? Does it produce a final decision? Does the buck stop somewhere?
Because if it fails, the whole system collapses into this absolute nightmare called infinite interpretive recursion. It's a loop where every rule needs another rule to explain it, which needs another rule to explain that one, and on and on and on, forever. You never, ever get a decision.
Second test, closure. Can the system solve its own problems using its own tools? Or, to function, does it constantly have to reach outside of itself and borrow logic from other places, like politics or morality?
The failure here is called narrative substitution. This happens when the legal protocol just runs out of road. It hits a dead end. And to make a decision, the decider has to substitute in an external story. Like, well, this outcome is more politically convenient, or this is what my gut says is moral. The system itself can't justify the decision on its own terms.
All right, our third test is functional separation. Just think of the system as a really well-designed machine. Do all the different parts, like the part that makes rules, the part that applies rules, the part that finds facts, do they all stay in their own lanes and do their specific jobs? Because when this test fails, you get what's called systemic contamination. The lines get all blurry. For instance,
The judge who is supposed to be applying a rule ends up creating a totally brand new rule right there on the spot. The system's internal logic is corrupted, and pretty soon you can't even tell which part is supposed to be doing what.
Our fourth test is for stability under specification. Now, you'd think in a robust system, the more detail you add, the clearer things should get, right? A more specific rule should bring clarity, not chaos.
But the failure mode here is this wild paradox, selective arbitrariness. Instead of making things clearer, adding more and more rules just creates a giant sea of contradictions. This gives a decision maker a whole menu of conflicting rules to choose from, so they can just cherry-pick whichever one justifies the outcome they already wanted. It makes the system completely arbitrary.
And finally, our fifth test, control of self-reference. Can the system handle talking about itself? For example, can it have rules about how to make new rules without tying itself up in a complete logical knot?
If it can't, it just collapses into a logical paradox. It ends up creating a statement that's impossible to resolve. Something like, this rule is not to be followed. The entire protocol just grinds to a halt. So the really crucial point here is that these 5 failures, they aren't about getting a bad outcome. They are fundamental structural breakdowns in the machinery of law itself.
So after going through all of that, how does this all come together? I mean, why bother with such an abstract, super technical analysis? Let's zoom out and look at the big takeaway here.
What this framework gives us is a new, really powerful, almost clinical tool. It doesn't ask if a legal system is good or if it's just. It asks a much more fundamental question. Is this system structurally capable of being law at all? Or is its claim to be law just a fancy decoration, a costume worn by the exercise of raw power, or just somebody's arbitrary choice? Now that's a question worth thinking about.